Welcome to Flow Unleashed. I'm Cameron Norsworthy, and this is your podcast for human performance. In our fast-paced world, it's easy to get caught up in the whirlwind of daily routines, goals, and the endless pursuit of success. Yet, there are moments, often triggered by life-altering experiences, that compel us to pause and recalibrate. These instances, whilst daunting, offer a unique opportunity to redefine success and align our lives with purpose and intention. In this episode, we are going to dive into what success tax means and the impact of our distractions and digital consumption on our brains. To unpack these areas, I've invited Dr Kristy Goodwin, a neuroperformance scientist and speaker on productivity in a digital world. Kristy is an award-winning author of the book Dear Digital, We Need to Talk, and Raising Your Children in a Digital World, and is a former educator in public and private schools. Dr. Kristy also lectured at Macquarie University and the University of Notre Dame, and she has a PhD on the impact of digital technologies. So, if you're ready to dive into digital dopamine and attention, how boredom builds creativity, how reprioritizing feels great, and parenting in a screen world, then let's dive in.
Flow Unleashed.
Welcome to the show, Kristy.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. So how did you get into this field?
I would love to say I had a very clearly planned out, well thought out career path and trajectory, but that wasn't the case. I initially started my work as an educator and then an academic, looking at the impact technology was having on children and teenagers, I call them screenagers, on their brains and bodies, their biology. And then it sort of morphed into how it's impacting us as adults. I think for many years we've wagged the finger at our young people and said they're addicted to technology, they can't put their devices down, but we've never really examined as adults our digital habits and behaviours. And it wasn't until I experienced a really serious health incident in the middle of COVID. Along with COVID, I also had really debilitating seizures to the point where one morning my husband was alerted by our Great Dane Tommy that I had yet another seizure on the floor next to our bed. He called an ambulance and I was rushed to a code red emergency ward and hooked up to a ventilator, unable to breathe. After extensive testing, and I will say I was a fully vaccinated, very fit woman with no underlying health issues. So the doctors were really at a loss to understand why. And after extensive testing, the only conclusion that the experts could come up with as to why I was having these seizures, unable to breathe, and so badly affected with COVID was that I was burnt out. Years and years of chronic stress had caught up with me. And even though I research and speak about, the impact of stress on our performance and our well-being, I had ignorantly, I will also say perhaps even arrogantly, dismissed the fact. I thought I could sidestep my own advice. I tried to delude myself into thinking that I could outperform my biology. And I kept pushing through. And, we all hear the whispers from our bodies, slow down, work at a more sustainable pace. And it wasn't until I was in that code red emergency ward and I could hear through the paper petition curtain next to me, the woman in the bed beside me taking the final breath of her life. And as I lay there in that bed, I was forced to confront my own possible mortality. Was the chronic stress and working to the point of, or beyond depletion, had that caught up with me. And I realized at that point in time, I had almost paid what I call the ultimate success tax. And I work with a lot of high performers and I see many people achieve amazing things in their careers, but they often do so at the expense of their physical health, their mental well-being, or their relationships. And so I made a pledge to myself in that hospital bed that if I recovered, I was going to start living and working in ways that were sustainable and apply all of the high performance strategies that I'd been teaching for so many years and really genuinely embed them in my life. So it was a very sobering moment, I will admit, but it really did change the trajectory of my life. And now I'm really passionate about talking about sustainable peak performance in this digitally demanding landscape we all now find ourselves in.
Wow, what an experience. Often when we're faced with those life-threatening experiences or moments of deep reflection of our mortality, like you said,
Oh,
it's a double-edged sword. But I often find I've had a few of those in my life, and I've
yeah,
found them actually the most liberating
they are,
moments.
yes. It was, in hindsight, I can now say out the other side that it's one of the best things that has really happened to me. And I know when I say that to some people, I get some strange looks for them, but it was the ultimate recalibration of my priorities and of my values. And in a way that, sitting down with a journal and writing what my priorities and values were would never elicit. So I'm not suggesting that you need to endure the experience of being in a code red emergency ward. And I also really am passionate about not letting people get to a point where their health is so severely compromised that we are then recalibrating our priorities. I think many of us have not taken the time to actually look at, are we climbing the mountain, firstly, that we want to be climbing? I think many high performers get caught up in momentum and pursuing goals and KPIs, and sometimes we're not even aware, are we climbing the right mountain? And we all know that when we climb a mountain, the best part of the experience is not necessarily when you get to the peak. It's actually the journey up there. And so I think so many of us are just operating in this frenetic, frantic, and frazzled way that we don't give ourselves permission to actually stop and recalibrate and look at, what do we want? Is this the life we want to be living? Are these the goals we genuinely want to be pursuing? And so for me, being flat in a hospital bed was that moment to reflect. Not necessarily recommended, but obviously something that I gleaned a lot from.
Yeah, it's interesting. We can get so lost in our goals and what's in front of us, and we become so attuned to our immediate environment that we often lose perspective, and it's very rare that we get an external influence so loud that
Yes.
we stop and recalibrate. And the old saying, life is a rehearsal, is cliche, but it's so true. And we're often not always taking time with purpose and intention to actually create the lives that we want. And we work hard and we go, and we push. And some of us end up burnt out, some of us end up stressed, some of us end up with biological or physiological conditions as a result of this consequence, because the body never lies.
Yes.
And all the time thinking we're doing the right thing, but from an embodied place, creating scars. And I love your framing of success tax. Can you tell me a little bit more, how success tax shows up for people in the day-to-day as opposed to necessarily the extremes?
Yes.
And how that can help?
Yes. So as I said earlier, the success tax to me in its simplest definition is where people achieve success, they hit their goals, they achieve their KPIs, they achieve whatever their definition of success is. And I think a really important caveat here is that we all should have different metrics of success. I think many of us try to emulate, popularized, westernized, sometimes metrics of success. And that's why I say, check in. Are you climbing the right mountain? Is the career progress a KPI or a success metric for you? Or is having a well-balanced life, and I sometimes cringe when I say that word, but a well-rounded life more of a success metric for you? Is success to you, achieving epic results at work whilst also being able to be present with your family and your friends and having hobbies and pursuits outside of work? So I think really recalibrating what success looks like to you. I often say to people, having a career that is absolutely soaring whilst your personal life sucks, that's not a really, truly, a defined metric of success. And so I think firstly we need to refine and redefine what does success look like for us, and also what does success in this season of life look like? Again, I think many of us have adopted and emulating models of success that may not be applicable in our stage of life. Do you have the responsibility in terms of caring and domestic responsibilities, be that with children, or perhaps is it with aging parents? Are you facing some health issues that just might mean your metrics of success need redefining in this season? So for me, it is knowing that you can achieve success and achieving success in a way that does not sacrifice your physical health, your mental well-being, and or relationships. And the worst thing that I see with many high performers is that they often achieve success, but they sacrifice the trifecta of all three. I'm sure you're the same. I work with many people who have really paid a toll. And I often say they've achieved success with sacrifice. I think the real flex, I think a true definition of success is someone who does achieve the success and it's without sacrifice. And I know that can sometimes sound cliched, success without sacrifice. Yes, sometimes we have to, work a little harder. Sometimes we have to step back from doing other things in certain seasons. But I think truly, when we get to the end of our life, and a book that I really love, I'm sure you've read this, 4,000 Weeks by Oliver Burkeman. Have you read that?
No, I haven't.
Great book, an absolutely fabulous book. And it's based on this premise that as humans, unfortunately, our time is finite. And on average, if we are one of the lucky ones who get, fortuitous with our health, and we protect and prioritize our health and well-being, we have an average global lifespan of roughly 80 years, give or take, depending on your gender and where you live geographically. That means you get roughly 4,000 weeks in your entire lifetime. I take that, and in my keynotes I talk about, that means if you're lucky, you will experience 4,000 Sundays in your entire life. And I think when we stop and pause, that's a rather confronting number. It's not very many when we really think about it. And I see so many people not getting the most of their Sundays, so because they're living in this really, I call it being a low-res, powered-down version of themselves. So on one hand, they might be experiencing some success, but is it the success that they have got, which has meant them sacrificing many other things along the way?
Yeah, it's interesting. When I'm coaching individuals of different ages, there's sometimes they come to coaching sessions because from their perspective there's something wrong. And often I see it as the greatest opportunity for them. And I'm always, this success tax as a concept I love, because tax, whilst we can evade it and avoid it, it eventually catches up with us. And for humans, whether it's a midlife crisis,
Yep.
Whether it's we've sacrificed our relationships
Yep.
and our friendships, and we're highly successful from a corporate position, but then we reach the age of 50 and 60 and go, what was all this for?
Yeah.
As we live a lonely retirement.
Yeah.
It catches up with us,
Duh.
or whether that's an athlete and suddenly their body breaks down.
Yeah.
At some stage, it always catches up with us. And being able to have that foresight and put effort into presence, into relationships, into those three components you talked about, helps to stave those scenarios. And it's a bit like going to bed early. It doesn't always feel great, and it's like I'm missing out. But when we reframe it as I'm investing in tomorrow,
Yep.
as opposed to I'm missing out tonight,
Yep.
then we can go to bed earlier with excitement.
I agree.
And I think what's also really interesting about your work is that tax is fatiguing. It's tiring.
Yep.
It's exhausting. It doesn't feel good. And as a result, what we often do is we immediately go to short-term immediate gratification, and technology and the digital world is like this open book for just giving us quick dopamine hits. I know your PhD was in this area, and you've written books in this area. So I'm really intrigued to hear how you see the digital world affecting ourselves as adults and as children.
Yeah. And before I jump in there, I just wanted to say something that really reverberated with me when you were just speaking, and something you said earlier is that our body keeps score. So even though we think we might be able to, outskirt or outrun how we operate as humans, I often say we cannot outperform our biological blueprint. Unfortunately, as humans, we have some biological constraints that we simply cannot outperform. And so I call our brain our human operating system, our HOS. And so I think many of us, and this will help answer your next question, is I think technology, given it's got its tentacles in every part of our lives, our professional and our personal lives have become enmeshed with technology, whether we want to acknowledge it or not. And I believe many of our digital habits and behaviors are having a profound impact on our brains and our bodies and our experience as humans. I often say we have ancient Paleolithic brains. We have brains that were biologically designed to go and forage, hunt, and get information. We have brains and bodies that were designed biologically to be physically active, not to be spending hours and hours a day being sedentary. Our biology needs sunlight, not, again, hours spent inside. Even something as simple as our eyesight. Our vision was primarily designed to be looking at things in the distance, not to be spending hours and hours a day doing near distance work. And so I think what is happening is that our digital habits and behaviors are influencing, shaping our human operating system, and they're incompatible. Technology is evolving at exponential rates. In the digital world, we have something called the digital penetration rate. And the digital penetration rate describes how many years it takes a technology to penetrate to 50 million global users. So I don't know, Cameron, if you remember the years, you probably will. I hope you say yes, otherwise it makes me feel really old. But when we used to have dial-up internet, we'd sit and we'd wait. Yes. Yes. And that was real delayed gratification, by the way. Kids today think a slow lag time on a website or an app to load is 7 seconds max. If it doesn't download or open in 7 seconds, they're on something else. So imagine if they had to wait for dial-up internet. But it took 7 years until 50 million people adopted dial-up internet. Facebook took around 19 months. YouTube took around 10 months. ChatGPT, to hit digital penetration rate, took around 2 months. So technology is evolving at exponential rates, but this human operating system has not evolved at the same pace. And so we've got this almost ancient infrastructure, this ancient Paleolithic brain operating in this digitally demanding high-tech world. So given that our brains were designed to go and forage and hunt, we were designed to be physically active, we were designed to be in proximity and connecting and talking to other humans. We were designed to be getting sunlight. What's happened is our brains have not evolved at the same pace that the technology is. We have not been designed to have unsolicited information constantly being thrust at us in the form of alerts and notifications. Physiologically, our brain cannot distinguish between a Teams notification pinging us and a tiger chasing us. Yes, we can psychologically discriminate between the two, but our brain says potential stressor or danger. The fact that it might vibrate if we've got a watch or our phone is on our body, that physical vibration can make us feel more alert and make us feel like this is important, urgent and important. The fact that by default, most of our notification bubbles tend to be red. Red we psychologically associate with danger, urgency and importance. The fact we've often got a number in our notification bubble telling us how many unread emails or notifications that we have implores us to go and check too. So we've got these digital habits and behaviors that are completely incompatible with our human operating system. And so that's why I think many of us are floundering in this digital landscape we are now living and working in on a daily basis.
Mm. And if we can, it'd be good just to double click on some of those differences, because I think when people get a better understanding of the brain and how we're interacting with the world, it helps to give awareness and recognition of what's going on. What do you see some of those those differences between what you call the human operating system and the world we're interacting with?
Yeah, so a really simple example, and I often say technology is having an invasive, but sometimes an invisible impact on our lives. And a very prime example that I use to share is that when we look at a screen, be that our laptop, our phone, our desktop computer, when we adopt what we call a narrow gaze and our eyes converge on a relatively small surface area, we biologically trigger our stress response, because usually when we are narrowed in on something, it is a high stakes situation. You know, we're looking for a potential object that might be a problem. We are assessing a situation. And so the mere act of us looking at a small surface area can trigger the stress response. Our human operating system is predominantly designed to be dilating our gaze, to be staring at, the woolly mammoth on the horizon, watching the sunset or the sunrise. And so when we are spending the preponderance of our days doing near distance work, and our eyes converge, we do not sigh as a result. Now, a unique part of our human operating system is that whilst we are awake, part of our physiology is that we are wired and designed to sigh roughly every 5 minutes while we're awake as a way to regulate our oxygen and carbon dioxide levels and to bring us back to a stress baseline. But when we adopt that narrow gaze, when our eyes converge, we do not sigh as much as we should. And so researchers have studied a phenomenon called email apnea. And believe it or not, when people go into their inboxes, many of them hold their breath. They dump a whole lot of cortisol, their heart rate accelerates, their pupils dilate, and they have a physiological stress response. Now, that can be from the subject or the sender. It could be from the content of the email. It can also be from the sheer act that when we're reading emails, our eyes are converging. So that's where I say, it's often very subtle, but very invasive ways that technology is impacting our lives. I mentioned earlier the fact that we're far more sedentary. Our brains make a whole lot of neurochemicals when we are physically active. But today we are sitting for obviously very long periods of time, often with very, very minimal physical movement in between. That is really counter to what our human operating system means. We have seen globally rates of myopia increase exponentially in recent years in children, teenagers, and adults across the globe. Myopia is nearsightedness, and many people are quick to say, it's looking at screens. Researchers are not so convinced. They think it is what screen time is eroding. What is screen time eroding? Time outside. For children and teenagers whose vision and eyes are still developing, we know they need at least 90 minutes of sunlight exposure interspersed throughout their days. Many children across the globe are not getting that 90 minutes. Now, they're not quite sure yet. Is it that while we're outside, we tend to look at things in the distance? So we're not doing near distance work. We're looking at the tree. We're looking at the ball that might be flying towards us. So our eyes are dilating their gaze, so we're not spending that near distance time. Or another plausible theory is that the sunlight and the vitamin D in particular that we get from sunlight is helping to elongate our optic nerve and stopping that myopic progression. Researchers aren't quite clear yet what the mechanism is there, but what we know is that we need, children and teenagers in particular need at least that 90 minutes exposure. So there are a whole range, I think I'd say they're cascading consequences of us, adopting these digital habits and behaviors that are counter to what our HOS really needs as humans.
Yeah, fascinating. I often talk about the evolutionary errors, and typically in regard to our I call the thinking brain or our explicit system or cold cognitive system that is more supercharged nowadays, because we promote it in education, but often because it's triggered because of this sort of sympathetic nervous fight, flight, freeze reaction, and we want to outthink it, and attention narrows, and all the time stopping us to be more intuitive, to be more spontaneous all the time, and having these attentional effects that you talked about are really, really interesting. And And as adults, we can self-regulate somewhat. With this knowledge, we can kind of go, okay, I realize that I'm spending far too much of my time looking at something a couple of feet away from me. Every minute or whatever, I'm going to change my gaze to look over my desk and look in the distance. What do you tell parents in terms of helping either build an environment that's going to be facilitated for their kids, or help them address the ever-increasing desire and need that kids have to engage in this digital world?
Yes, look, I used to do a lot of work in the parenting space, and I will say I have 3 sons, and ranging in age from 14 right down to 6. So I understand firsthand the digital dilemmas, the digital conundrum that many parents experience firsthand. I don't believe that digital amputation is the solution. Cutting off technology, banning it, makes it the forbidden fruit. We often drive the behaviour underground. The inevitable reality is, as for us as parents, is that our kids are going to inherit a very digital world. And so we need to deliberately teach, we need to cultivate sustainable digital habits and behaviours. And the reason that I shifted my work from working with children and teens to now working with adults, and particularly high performers, is that we have to be good digital role models. The brain has mirror neurons. And so as parents and as caregivers, we can be espousing, all of the right, switch it off, turn it, disconnect, have time to be idle with your thoughts. But if we're not role modeling that ourselves, our kids will never adopt those habits. I also believe that kids need to learn these skills through explicit instruction and through guided experience. They don't just learn digital habits and behaviours through osmosis. So when I used to work with parents, I used to say there's 3 B's to get right. The first B is that parents have to establish boundaries. They have to establish boundaries with their children, not on them. So it's not about giving them an iPad contract or a gaming agreement and saying, sign here. You have to co-create boundaries, and you need to have boundaries beyond how much time. How much is one piece of the puzzle, but parents also need to have boundaries around what they can use, when they can use screens, particularly before sleep and first thing in the morning, where are the no-go tech zones, and with whom they can use them. The second B is all around basic needs, making sure that young people's basic needs, their human operating systems needs, are not displaced by screens. We know that teenagers throughout the globe are spending, for teenagers, over 40 hours per week on screens. Let's be honest, that's more than a full-time job. And let's also be equally honest, not a lot of that time is doing their schoolwork. Some of it is, but a lot of that time is, their leisure use of screens. So we've really got to make sure that their basic physical and psychological needs, are they getting enough connection? Are they getting enough play, movement, sunlight, all the really vital things that they need for optimal development? So that second B is all around preserving and protecting their basic needs. And the third B is all around boredom, getting our young people accustomed to being idle with their thoughts, not for hours at a time if that's not, achievable in the short term, but getting them, making sure we're not placating them or allowing them to placate themselves every time they experience a big emotion by reverting to a screen. When they're angry or upset, when they're noisy in a cafe, if we constantly condition them to reverting to a device, we are bypassing really important self-regulation skills. Boredom is one of the things that I talk to adults, high performers. Our brains, our human operating system was not designed to be on all the time. And so we need time to be bored. When we do, we activate the default mode network. And that's often when ideas germinate, we solve complex problems. But our young people are growing up in a world where they're very rarely, if ever, bored. So, I encourage parents, if you can get those 3 Bs right, I think we can help our children to cultivate those healthy, productive, and purposeful relationships with technology.
Jen, just to summarize them again, 3 Bs.
Yep. Boundaries, basic needs, boredom.
Boredom's such an interesting one for me because it's one that a lot of people wouldn't necessarily think of, because there's such a pressure to stimulate, advance, upskill. And it's something I actively try and create for my kids. And I'm always amazed that when we go through, the phase of boredom, if you like, is
Yes.
my child's agitated, they're frustrated, then they want to do something. So they come to me and say, can I watch TV? Can I watch TV? Can I watch TV? Can I watch TV? And if I'm tired and stressed, I might go, oh, all right then. And if I've got my wits about me, I'll be like, okay, well, that's interesting. So, what are you going to do with that frustration?
Yeah.
Oh, I've got nothing to do. So they get frustrated, then they go in search for things, then they reach that state of boredom. And then 5 minutes later, they're into something.
Yeah.
Their creativity has taken hold, and they've found some innovative or intuitive idea, and they've applied themselves to a situation.
Yeah.
And they're doing something far more engaging and meaningful than what they would have previously done, just to sort of satisfy that boredom. And using their faculties as opposed to just their faculties being numbed and entertained.
Yeah.
In a world where we're kind of taught we need to innovate for breakfast, how do we actually get this boredom into our lives?
Yeah, and I agree. I think the most important thing you said there is letting them sit in that agitation. I think so many of us, even as adults, the minute we often feel that discombobulated, agitated state, then we reach for that, as I said before, placating ourselves with our screen, self-soothing with our screen. So I think it is, again, being a good role model, showing that you switch off, letting them have that lived experience, so that, and again, often that it's only once children have switched off and physiologically and psychologically felt the difference. I think many young people, and you said it before, stuck in this cycle of sympathetic nervous state activation. I think many of our young people are stuck in that chronic sympathetic overload. And it's only when they have the opportunity. I've worked previously with some school camp providers, and many of them made a policy that children and teenagers couldn't bring devices on school camps for a host of reasons. And what they started to say is exactly what you described. In the first couple of hours and days of the camp, the children and teenagers were often visibly agitated, distressed, frustrated because they didn't have their digital appendage in close proximity. But by the conclusion of the camp, many of the children started commenting on how they felt better. Many of them reported that they'd slept better, that they were having better conversations, that they just often couldn't put their finger on it, but they physiologically just felt better. And so I think we need to have that lived experience to know what that feels like. And, many adults say that when they go on holidays, if they've been somewhere that didn't have Wi-Fi for whatever reasons, if they've had an opportunity to disconnect. Now, I'm very clear here, it's not about doing a digital detox. They do not work. They don't create sustainable long-term change. But I think having pockets of time where we can switch off with our kids, and even sometimes as adults sharing, I'm finding this just as uncomfortable as you are. It feels really strange. But persisting with it, I think, is the key. And then having that time to reflect on how they felt better, I think, is a really profound thing. With a lot of adults, when I do keynotes, I often ask them, where were you? What were you doing when the last great idea germinated, when you solved a complex problem? And most audience members will say to me, in the shower, in the car, or driving, going for a walk, on holidays with no Wi-Fi. In all of the thousands of people I've spoken to, I've never had one person, not one, said to me it's when I was in my inbox or when I was in an Excel spreadsheet. So I think, again, remembering that for ourselves, but then giving our children that opportunity to experience that firsthand is just so important and a really undervalued skill.
Yeah, and allowing all of us to have these different states. Like you said, we're so constantly switched on, and it is exhausting, and we leave a lot of other faculties behind. What are some of the, I guess, the daily symptoms of that ordinarily we might just ignore?
So One of the things I say to people is that our prefrontal cortex, so the part of our brain that I often say it's the CEO of our brain, or it's the air traffic control system. It does the mentally demanding work predominantly. Our prefrontal cortex only has a 4 to 6 hour battery life per day. Now, a lot of people misconstrue what I say there. I'm not saying you should have a 4-hour workday. That would be lovely. But to do the mentally demanding, taxing work, we really only have a 4 to 6 hour window. So we're not designed to be working and thinking and making decisions all of the time. So our time is really finite. So I think it's being mindful most certainly of that, again, human operating system constraint that we often ignore. So there's some of that's a key thing that I think we often overlook. Remind me of the question. I don't know if I answered that properly. You asked about...
Yeah, when we do ignore the
Yes.
limitations
What
of the
do I
human operating system, what
Yep.
are the daily symptoms that you're seeing that, we can all start to become slightly more aware of in our lives?
Yes. So what I see at a macro level is people living as low-res, powered-down versions of themselves. I often say they're living like a pixelated reality of their life. And I see this manifest in 3 key domains. I see people who are stressed, people who are chronically exhausted, and people who are perpetually distracted. Stressed, exhausted, and distracted. We are not, as humans, designed to be always on, rarely focused, and never recovered. Our human operating system was not designed for that way of living and operating. And so I think acknowledging, if you are feeling now, I'm sure you agree, and I hope you agree, Cameron, that stress gets a bad rap. As humans, we are biologically designed for stress, but we're designed for really short bursts of stress, and we're designed to close out the stress cycle. We're not designed to be going from back-to-back stressful meetings to a bulging inbox to triaging our team's, chat function to 88 WhatsApp messages. So many of us are leaving in this chronically elevated sense of stress, and we're very rarely closing out the stress cycle. Equally with exhaustion, sometimes, extenuating circumstances might mean that you are tired, but if you are operating and your baseline is exhaustion, this is why I'm a huge proponent of wearables, actually tracking your own biometric data, because what gets measured gets managed. So if you can start to see, hey, I'm noticing some trends in, when my sleep is compromised, or hey, look at this. And one of the benefits I think of wearables is that we can start to see correlations that we might otherwise overlook. When my daytime stress is really high, or when I don't bring my stress down to a baseline before I go to sleep, my sleep quality is really compromised. So managing daytime stress might be a priority. Hey, look at this. I keep waking up between 2 and 3 a.m. Well, that's also on the days where my stress has been much higher. So I think starting to, and again, you said it earlier, tuning in. I think many of us have numbed ourselves to listening. You said our body keeps score. Our body does not lie. I think taking the time or using tools. I think wearable devices can be a great tool to complement our intuition and to complement our somatic experience as well. They certainly don't replace tuning in and listening to what our body is trying to communicate to us. But I think coupling tools with our own lived experience can be a great way for us to start to recognize how we might be feeling stressed, exhausted, and distracted constantly.
Yeah, I think the data's fantastic as long as it doesn't override that intuitive connection with our own stress. But as you said at the beginning, that stress is essential for peak performance.
Yes.
It heightens our arousal, it
Yep.
piques our attention, it gets us into the zone, it amplifies our abilities, but it's that continued, like you said, when we don't break that cycle, then things start to break down. And
Yes.
I'm often very aware that when I have a continuation of stress, I become very, very cerebral.
Yes.
My thinking brain takes over because it
Yep.
starts to need to
Yeah.
hijack the system in order to contain it and justify why I need to continue.
Yeah.
And my decision making starts to mar, right? I start to kind of make decisions that are aligned with just doing enough, just getting by. And then my appetite for wanting to be my best or do my best or be 100% present kind of gets lost and goes out the window. And, you know, I'm lucky enough to work with a lot of high performers who are really motivated to be their best, you know, and they'll give everything for that extra 1%. But the majority of people I see are miles away from that. You know, they're not aiming for that extra 1%. They're aiming to consolidate coping strategies just to get by, just to survive. And I think survive is probably too much of a strong word. I mean, a quarter of the population does have some sort of mental health related scenario, but there's this, it's okay. You know, I don't need to feel my best. There's this deprioritization, devaluation of how important it is for us to feel great and be our best on a daily basis, not reserved for the weekend or reserved for the holiday in 2 months. Or how do we change that equation? I mean, I'm not asking you to play God, but in your work, like, how do you see actual concrete changes occurring to that equation where we can prioritize the quality of what we do?
Yes, and I agree wholeheartedly. A lot of the high-performing clients I work with have almost normalized stress and exhaustion. You know, it's a hallmark of being a high performer. I also think we have become immune to feeling good. You know, it's that frog in the boiling pot. We are unaware often that we are experiencing chronic stress or that our sleep is so, you know, substantially compromised. And there's a symbiotic relationship between stress and sleep. I often say our sleep does not impact our performance and well-being. It dictates it. And I see many high performers, as you said, looking for the 1% tweak, you know, looking for, and I don't particularly like the word hack, but many people come to me and say, I just need some hacks, some neuro hacks, some brain hacks, how I can get 1% better. But when we step back and look at all of the rudimentary things, that's not often what's going to move the lever, those 1% things. We've got to get back to some of those really basic things that our human operating system needs. And for most of the people I work with, I would hazard a guess to say it's the same, similar to you, managing sleep and stress are really critical. And so I talk to a lot of people. I've created something called a flourishing formula. And the first pillar in the flourishing formula is building our stress adaptability. I think if you want to flourish in this digitally intense world that we now find ourselves in, you have to develop your capacity to dance with stress. Stress is inevitable. It's not necessarily bad for us. There was some recent research with surgeons, and they observed something that they're calling the clutch effect. And if a surgeon experiences a stressful event within the first 5 minutes of a procedure, the patient has far better clinical outcomes than if the surgeon hadn't experienced stress. For all the reasons you just alluded to, you know, it heightens our senses, we develop tunnel vision, we often shut off some of our superfluous senses that we don't need. This is why when we're stressed, we drop our peripheral vision. And that's why we spill the cup of coffee all over our keyboard, trip over the cat on the floor, and the cable that's next to the computer because we've dropped our peripheral vision when we're stressed. So developing that capacity to deal with stress. And I think there's 3 components of building our stress adaptability. The first one, we have to reduce, not eliminate, but just reduce the little micro stresses in our days. I think we've become so immune to things like alerts and notifications. Remember, ancient brain that was designed to go and get information. If we've got unsolicited things constantly pinging us, vibrating, it triggers a stress response. So disabling non-essential notifications, bundling or batching, you can now choose what time or times of the day your various notifications come to you rather than them dribbling in and distracting you, or even creating VIP lists. So when you put your phone or your laptop on do not disturb mode, the world gets blocked apart from those few people that might be on that VIP list. So reducing little and taking the time to think, what are the little things that are making us stressed? Is it going from back-to-back virtual meetings? Lots of research tells us still in 2025, virtual meetings are stressful for our brains. It's the first time in all of human history where we see what we look like in a social context. We notice that we tilt our head a strange way, that our hair needs colouring, our eyebrows need plucking, or we're going bald. It's called impression management. If there is a 1.2 second lag between when I say something and the person or people on the virtual call responding, that 1.2 second lag, which can happen, if we've got dodgy internet connection or if there's a whole lot of people on the call, that can be enough for us to misconstrue their lack of response as disapproval, frustration, anger. So there's a whole host of things that can make us feel really stressed. The sheer fact that we're spending hours looking at our screens, again, little micro stressor. The second thing we can do to build our stress adaptability is we have to develop our tolerance to hold stress. A great book, Paul Taylor, has written a book called Death by Comfort. I don't know if you've come across Paul's work, but Paul talks about this idea that we as humans need to experience physical discomfort. We are designed to, do hard things. We are now living in a world, as you alluded to before, of instant gratification. We are hot, we flick on the air conditioner. We're hungry, we order Uber Eats. We have become accustomed to instant gratification, and we are often, today in 2025, not experiencing physical stress like we once did. And when we're ill-equipped to deal with physical stress, we cannot deal with psychological stress in the same way. So engaging in practices that develop your tolerance for stress. Part of your brain called the anterior mid-cingulate cortex, it's basically the willpower center of your brain, can get strengthened by doing hard things. So we have to choose challenge over comfort. And this is why things like deliberate cold exposure, ice baths, cold water exposure have become popularized. Deliberate heat exposure, vigorous physical activity, anything that you do that your brain finds and body finds hard develops that tolerance for stress. The third part of our stress adaptability, so the first one was dropping those micro stresses. The second one was developing our tolerance to hold stress. And the third one is embedding practices that that build our stress resilience. So when we are facing a stressful situation, we can respond and not react. Is it breathing? Is it closing our eyes? Is it sighing? Is it having some time in nature? Is it having a conversation? We know one of the best things we can do to drop our stress is be in close proximity with other humans. We create oxytocin, which is the social bonding hormone, just by being in the mere presence of others. So how can we how can we build our resilience so that when we need to face a stressful encounter, we can respond accordingly? So I think the real key thing that I see with a lot of high performers is if we can build that stress adaptability, they are designed to then flourish. Their sleep, improves. Their capacity to focus and eliminate distractions often improves. And there are a whole lot of other cascading consequences. But I think we are operating, particularly in Western society, where we have really normalized stress. It's almost a hallmark of being a high performer. How are you? People stressed or are busy.
Yeah, it's weird if things aren't going at 100 miles an hour. Things must be going wrong.
Yes, or you're not working hard enough.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that's also normalized is the cape, that we should all be superhuman. And, what I love about what you've explained is this human operating system is a biological entity that has finite and limitations.
Yeah.
Right? It has finite attentional span and bandwidth. It has physiological limitations to the stress. And when we break those or push past those boundaries, there are real consequences for them. Short-term decision-making.
Yeah.
And long-term, our appetite for quality goes into our physiology and so forth.
Yeah.
Yeah, really interesting chat. And thank you so much for your time, Christine. Coming towards the end of the podcast, I always ask a couple of questions. One, a book or a film that has had a huge impact on you, and why?
4,000 Weeks, that Oliver Burkeman book that I mentioned before. It was supposed to be a book about productivity. That's why I picked it up. I'm like, yes, I need it. I love reading about productivity and performance. It was a book that shifted the way I think, particularly reminding me that our time is finite. I often say we have 3 human currencies that are under threat in our digital world: time, energy, and our attention. And I think we've forgotten. We often delude ourselves into thinking that we do have an abundance of time and energy, and our focus is being severely compromised in this digital world. So 4,000 Books was honestly a game changer for me, and helped me to recalibrate how I look at my life.
Time to flip the mic.
I would love to know what you do consistently to help you live as a high-res, powered-up human. What's something that you do?
Oh. So you've touched on sleep. I protect that. I feel like that's super important for me. I seem to want to sleep lots.
Well done.
So I like sleeping. If I have a couple of days where I'm short on sleep, then I purposefully make sure it's in my calendar that I can sleep for longer. In some ways, I'm very lucky in having young children, and because I kind of see them as my little Buddhas. They help me to be present. They help me to let go of the world around me. They help me play. They help me stay in the moment. Whereas my head or my brain is constantly trying to put me into my brain and keep me in hamster wheels. So I think that I capitalize on, as opposed to seeing that as a stressful distraction. I see that as a really helpful interaction and helping me perform well. And then, there's a host of things. I do lots of saunas and ice baths, and I kind of eat well, and I guess for me, having flow as a framework is always an underpinning, because that's such a core skeleton for me. My decision making's easier. It's kind of like, well, what's most aligned with me being in my flow? What's most aligned with me being in my best situation? And I might make decisions that counter that for a little while, such as going over to Sydney for the weekend and watching the rugby with a whole load of friends and going out and having a great time. But that's in balance with then coming back and having that routine and space. And so my main answer to that question is probably having flow as a philosophical framework to how I want to be and how I want to show up in the world. And that I'm not riddled with questions or doubts of what should I do or shouldn't I do. It just makes everything a lot easier.
Well done. And can I acknowledge that recognizing that children can be an asset, not a liability. I think there's so much dialogue about how our kids can hamstring us and defer or diminish our performance and our well-being. Part of the vernacular is that your sleep's never going to be the same once you've had children. I really appreciated your positive outlook, and I agree. My children have been a blessing. They've forced me to step up. So that was just such a lovely thing to hear from somebody who values performance, because our kids really can teach us so much if we're present to it, as you identified.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for your time.
Pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening to Flow Unleashed. If you want to learn more about flow, I've recently published my book, How to Find Flow, with Blink Publishing. In it, I guide readers through Ready, Steady, Flow, 3 simple steps for high performance, resilience, and personal well-being. You can find the link to my book in the podcast description. If you like this episode, please subscribe, and the next episode will effortlessly drop into your playlist. Bye for now.